They call this place the Black Hills, though from where I stand looking out over the endless sea of trees they look more green than black. It is an ancient stretch of land, a dome of granite and pine rising out of the Great Plains, an island of forest in an ocean of grass. The Lakota people called it Pahasapa, the heart of everything that is. Early explorers named it for the dark appearance it takes on from a distance, when the dense conifers absorb the sunlight and the hills loom like sleeping giants against the horizon. At 43 years old, I came here looking for one thing only: silence. My name is Joseph Wilhite. For 20 years, I worked as an urban planner back in Chicago. I spent my days drafting zoning ordinances, designing traffic flow patterns, calculating population densities, and organizing the chaotic intersecting lines that define modern civilization. I lived and breathed geometry, logistics, and the relentless human need to measure, categorize, and control every inch of space we occupy. I was good at it, too. I prided myself on precision, on order, on making sense of disorder. But eventually, the noise got inside my head. The sirens and the horns and the shouting crowds were bad enough, but it was the invisible noise that did the damage. The constant pressure of millions of lives overlapping, the sheer weight of so much history, so much construction, so much change happening all at once. I started having dreams where I was trapped inside a blueprint, walking down streets that were just lines on paper, surrounded by buildings that were just squares and rectangles. I woke up gasping for air, needing to see something that hadn't been designed by an architect, something that didn't have an address or a zoning code. I needed a place where the only thing to measure was the wind and the smoke. So I applied for the seasonal position at Spruce Ridge Lookout, a wooden tower perched at nearly 6,000 feet above sea level, accessible only by a rough dirt road that becomes impassable with even a moderate amount of rain or snow melt. It is one of the most isolated posts in the Black Hills National Forest, located deep in the interior, miles away from the nearest campground, hiking trail, or paved road. Perfect for me. I arrived in late May, just as the last patches of snow were melting off the higher northern slopes, turning the ground into a soft, muddy carpet of pine needles and damp earth. The drive up took nearly 2 hours on roads that grew progressively worse, narrower, rougher, as if the forest itself was actively discouraging visitors. When my truck finally rounded the final bend and the tower came into view, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a standard design common to the American West. 4 sturdy, peeled log legs, each nearly 2 feet thick, rising 40 feet into the air to support a single room, 12 feet by 12 feet, wrapped entirely in glass on all 4 sides, topped with a galvanized metal roof that caught the sunlight and glinted like a mirror. It sat right on the crest of the ridge, the highest point for miles in every direction, giving a clear, unobstructed view of the world below. North, toward the granite peaks of Custer State Park and the mysterious faces of Mount Rushmore, barely visible as faint bumps on the skyline. South into the deep, unbroken wilderness that stretches toward the Nebraska border. East and west into valleys, so deep and thick with trees, they hold shadows long after the sun has risen high above. Bolted to the side of the structure was a metal sign, weathered by decades of wind and rain, the paint faded, but still legible. Spruce Ridge Elevation, 5,982 feet Est, 1937. The caretaker who met me there was a ranger named Hale, a man built like a bear, with a beard that matched the gray of the granite, and eyes that had seen too much of the wild to be easily impressed. He helped me unload my supplies, months' worth of canned food, propane tanks, rain gear, maps, books, and equipment. hauling everything up the steep open staircase that spiraled around the outer legs of the tower. "Quiet up here," Hale said, wiping sweat from his brow as we set the last box down inside the living quarters. His voice was rough, as if he rarely used it. Too quiet for some folks. Drives them a little strange by August. "You a reader?" "I'm an observer," I told him, running my hand along the smooth wood of the desk that stood in the center of the room. It was worn smooth by 70 years of elbows and notebooks. Hale grunted, looking at me with a mixture of pity and assessment. "Well, the job is simple. Scan the horizon every 15 minutes. Look for smoke. Report coordinates via radio, using the Osborne Firefinder mounted right here. Keep the official log accurate. And stick to the trail if you go down. The trees all look the same up here. Easy to get turned around." He paused, leaning against the door frame, looking out at the endless green expanse rolling away below us. Then he turned back, pointing a thick finger at the large leather-bound logbook lying open on the desk. It was the official record, passed from lookout to lookout for generations. "One more thing," he said, his tone dropping slightly, becoming more serious. "You'll see notes in the margins. From the previous guy, Elias Vance. He was here 4 years. Good man, but he spent too much time looking, too much time thinking. You ignore anything he wrote that isn't about weather or fire, especially this part here." He flipped a few pages back and pointed to a line written in heavy, dark pencil, underlined twice. "Count nothing else." "What does that mean?" I asked. Hale shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave the page. "Just what it says. You watch for smoke. You watch for storms. You don't count the trees. You don't count the rocks. You don't try to map every curve of the land. The hills are big, Will Height. Too big to understand. You try to measure everything, and your head starts to play tricks on you. Elias." He started seeing patterns where there weren't any. Started thinking the forest was doing things it wasn't. "What kind of things?" "Growing, moving, changing shape when you weren't looking." Hale laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Crazy mountain talk. Elias left last month, transferred out, said he couldn't handle the repetition. Just stick to the job description, keep the radio on, and you'll be fine. Supply drop is scheduled for every 2 weeks. If you need anything else, you radio in, but don't expect a fast response. We're a long way from anywhere up here." With that, he descended the stairs, started his truck, and vanished down the road, leaving me in total silence. The first week was exactly what I had hoped for. Peace, solitude, order. I established a routine immediately, the way I always do. I woke at 5 a.m., before the sun, made strong coffee on the small propane stove, and sat on the wooden deck wrapped around the room, watching the gray light slowly turn gold as the sun crested the eastern peaks. The air here was thin, crisp, and so clean it felt like drinking cold water when you breathed it in. It smelled of ponderosa pine, that distinct sweet scent of vanilla and resin that hangs heavy in the heat of the day, mixed with dry granite and damp earth. I learned the landmarks quickly. I memorized the shape of the hills. I knew exactly where the large dead snag stood, bleached white by the sun, marking the northern end of the West Ridge. I knew where the rocky outcrop jutted out, bare and jagged at the southern end, and I knew exactly how many trees stood along that ridgeline between them. 412. I counted them on the second morning, just to pass the time, just to prove to myself that my eye for measurement hadn't faded. I moved slowly, binoculars in hand, tracing the skyline from north to south, distinguishing every mature tree that rose high enough to be seen from this vantage point. It took me nearly an hour. 412 distinct crowns, perfectly consistent. I wrote it down in my personal notebook, a separate book I kept beside the official log. Day 2, 412 pines, West Ridge, clear sky, wind and W, light, visibility, unlimited. It became a ritual. Every morning, coffee in hand, I would count them again. It grounded me. In a landscape that looked infinite and repetitive, it was something concrete, something fixed, something I could define. It was my anchor. Day 3, 412. Day 4, 412. Day 5, 412. Day 6, 412. Day 7, 412. I even went down there on the 7th afternoon, hiking the 1.5-mile trail that wound down the slope and along the base of that ridge, just to confirm. I walked the length of it, touching the rough, furrowed bark of the massive trunks, stepping over roots as thick as my waist. I noted the gaps between them, sections of sheer granite rock where nothing grew, patches of scrub oak that didn't grow tall enough to break the skyline. There was simply no physical space for any more large trees. 412 was the absolute maximum number that could possibly exist there. I sat on a flat stone near the southern end, looking back up at the tower rising above the treetops. It looked small and fragile from down here, perched high on the spine of the hill. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. I had mapped this section. I knew it. I had reduced the wild chaos of nature to a number, a fixed value. I returned to the tower as the shadows lengthened, cooked a simple dinner, and watched the sun dip below the western hills, turning the sky into a bruise of purple and red. I went to sleep that night feeling better than I had in years. I was master of my small domain. On the morning of the 8th day, things changed. I woke before the sun, as was my habit. The sky was transitioning from deep indigo to pale, milky blue, the first light touching the very highest branches of the pines, turning their needles into tiny points of flame. The air was still, not a breath of wind moving, the silence so complete I could hear the faint tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker miles away in the valley below. I poured my coffee, leaned against the cold metal railing, and lifted my binoculars to my eyes. I focused on the dead snag at the north end, found my starting point, and began. 1, 2, 3, 20, 50, 100. I moved systematically, section by section, tree by tree, just as I had done every day. My mind drifted slightly, running on autopilot, familiar with the rhythm of it. 410, 411, 412, 413, 414. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped counting. I lowered the binoculars and blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. There was a slight haze this morning, maybe. Some smoke drifting in from a controlled burn somewhere far to the south. Maybe the light was playing tricks. I lifted them again. I started over, much slower, focusing with intense urban planner precision. I counted the gaps between the trees to be sure. I noted the unique shapes of specific crowns. The double-topped pine at position 127, the leaning trunk at 290, the 3 trees growing out of a single base at 355. They were all there, exactly where they should be. But between the leaning trunk and the triple base, there were now 4 trees, not 3. 414. I stood there for a long time, the coffee growing cold in my hand. I went to my notebook and checked the previous entries. 412, every single day. I remembered walking the ridge just yesterday. I remembered the bare patch of gray granite where nothing grew. Miscounted yesterday, I muttered to myself, though I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't. Must have missed 2 small ones hidden behind the canopy, or maybe they grew faster than I thought. I laughed at my own joke, but it sounded hollow in the silence. Trees take decades to grow to that size. They don't add 6 feet of height and a full crown of branches in 24 hours. I wrote in the book. Day 8, 414. Visibility, excellent. Possible error in previous data. Note, check aerial maps. I spent the rest of the morning going through the station records. In a metal cabinet beneath the desk, I found large rolled topographic maps and aerial photographs taken by the Forest Service 5 years prior. I unrolled them carefully on the floor, weighing down the corners with rocks I kept on the shelf. The aerial photo was crystal clear, taken from directly overhead. I traced the western ridge with my finger. I could see the shadows of the trees, the gaps of rock, the distinct texture of the forest floor. I counted them on the photograph. 412. Exactly. I sat back on my heels, staring at the image. It was a snapshot of reality, frozen in time. And yet, the reality outside my window now contained 2 more entities that were not present in the record. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was suffering from sensory deprivation, a well-documented psychological effect of isolation. Your brain, starved of stimulation, starts creating details to keep itself occupied. You see faces and clouds, hear voices in the wind, perceive patterns in randomness. This was just my brain adjusting to the quiet, finding something to measure because it couldn't stand the idea of an unquantifiable world. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ridgeline in my mind, and every time I opened them, I felt like the room had shifted slightly, as if the tower had turned imperceptibly on its base while I blinked. The 9th morning, 417. 3 more, perfectly spaced, filling a gap I remembered as solid stone. The 10th morning, 423. 6 added, including one that stood directly in the center of a rocky outcrop I had sat on just days before. They weren't small saplings either. They were full-grown trees, identical in shape, height, color, and texture to the centuries-old ponderosas surrounding them. They had thick, rugged bark with deep crevices. They had full crowns laden with pine cones. They cast distinct dark shadows on the ground below. When I zoomed in until the image filled my vision, I could see individual needles, clusters of new growth, dead branches lower down, the complex architecture of a living thing. They were real, undeniably, physically there. But they were also impossible. I began to notice other things. Small things, easy to ignore at first, but which accumulated like dust on a shelf. The trail I had blazed down to the creek seemed slightly longer than it used to be. I knew the distance was roughly 1.25 miles. I had paced it off. Now walking it took 20 minutes longer. Not because I was walking slower, but because the space itself seemed to have expanded. The bends in the path felt sharper, the curves more repetitive. The landmarks I used to navigate, the large boulder shaped like a bear, the lightning-struck oak, the patch of bright red lichen on the cliff face were still there, but I started seeing them elsewhere too. I would be hiking a completely different drainage and suddenly spot the bear boulder again, sitting on a different hillside, at a different angle, looking exactly the same. At first I thought I was walking in circles, but I always knew exactly where the tower was relative to the sun. And the light. The light was wrong. In the real world, light is chaotic. The sun moves, clouds pass, trees sway, creating a constantly shifting pattern of brightness and shadow. Here the light was consistent. Shadows were sharp, distinct, and they stayed in the exact same place for hours, even as the sun clearly moved across the sky. If I looked away and looked back, the shadows would have shifted to match the new position of the sun, but if I watched them continuously, they never moved at all. It was as if the landscape was being rendered, drawn in detail only where my attention was focused, and frozen in place everywhere else. By the 12th morning, the count was 441. 29 new trees in 4 days. I was terrified now, but it was a cold, sharp kind of fear. The kind that makes you hyper-aware, that makes you study everything twice. I went back to the logbook, the official one, the one Hale had warned me about. I flipped past the dry reports of wind speed and humidity, past the coordinates of small fires long extinguished, looking for the notes Elias Vance had left behind. They were everywhere, scribbled in the margins, written upside down between lines, tucked into the back pages on scraps of paper. His handwriting was neat, precise, similar to my own, but it grew tighter, smaller, more compressed as the dates advanced, as if he was trying to cram too much meaning into too little space. Day 103, first anomaly, South Ridge, 2 trees where there was open ground, checked map. Map says ground. Eyes say trees. I walk there. Ground is dirt now, not rock. Reality updates to fit the object. Day 189. It's not growth. Growth is messy. Growth has variation. These are duplicates, exact copies of the trees next to them. Same branching angle, same height, same spread. Nature doesn't do perfect geometry. Nature is chaos. This is design, replication. Day 240. I tried to draw the view today. I sketched the West Ridge carefully, scale for scale. When I finished and looked up, every gap I had left empty in my drawing was now filled with a tree. I defined the space as empty, so it filled it. I defined the space as forest, so it expanded. It feeds on definition, it feeds on measurement. Day 311. The maps are wrong. All the maps. The USGS quad sheets I have here. They show Spruce Ridge is covering about 3 square miles. I paced the perimeter yesterday. It is over 12 square miles now. It gets bigger every day. The horizon recedes, the valleys deepen, the complexity increases. Day 402. I went to the edge of the known forest. I walked south for hours, expecting to hit the open plains eventually. I never did. The plains are gone, replaced by more hills, more pines, exactly the same hills, exactly the same pines. The land is folding in on itself, repeating the pattern infinitely, stretching the fabric of space to contain more of the same. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the page, my fingers trembling, and there, written clearly in the very center of the page, dated exactly 1 year prior to the day I arrived. Day 412. I count the pines at sunrise. There are always more than yesterday. Joseph, if you are reading this, they assigned you here because you are like me. You like order, You like numbers. You like to know exactly where things are and how many there are. You think you are observing the forest. You are building it. Every time you name a tree, every time you count it, every time you fix it in your mind, you validate its existence, and the system responds by generating another one just like it because that is what it does. It is a recursive function, a loop. It generates based on input. And you are the input. He knew my name. He knew I was coming. How? Unless everyone who came here was someone like me, someone who needed order, someone who needed to count, someone who would inevitably feed the machine. Do not try to leave, he continued, the handwriting becoming frantic, letters slanted and crowded together. I tried. I packed my truck. I drove down the road. I drove for an hour, keeping the sun on my left shoulder, heading east toward Custer. I drove straight. I never turned. And then, ahead of me, rising above the trees, I saw the tower. Spruce Ridge. I had driven in a straight line and ended up exactly where I started. The land curves, not like a sphere, like a drawing that folds the paper back over itself. The distance you travel equals the distance you observe. If you think it's far, it becomes far. If you think it's close, it shrinks. Day 488. I have stopped counting. I look at the ridge, but I do not see individual trees. I see a wall of green. I see texture. I see light and shadow. The numbers stopped increasing for 3 days. Then I got scared. I needed to know. I counted again. Within an hour, 10 new trees appeared. It is addictive. It wants you to measure. It craves the attention. It is attention. It is the act of perception made physical. Day 522. I am leaving today. I am walking out, off trail, straight north, and I will not look back. I will not measure. I will not observe. I will just move. If I succeed, I will never come back. If I fail, then I am still here. I am part of the pattern. Remember, the hills are not growing. They are generating, and they will never stop as long as there is someone watching. I dropped the book onto the desk, the heavy leather cover slamming shut with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. I walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the view was breathtaking. Endless miles of ponderosa pines rolling away toward the horizon, golden in the morning sun, looking like a vast green ocean frozen in place. But now I saw it. Now I understood. I had spent 20 years planning cities, organizing space, defining boundaries. I had come here to escape that, but I had brought my nature with me. I couldn't help it. I looked at the forest and I saw units, I saw countable objects, I saw geometry and the black hills of this specific part of it, this anomaly. It wasn't just land, it was a mechanism, a perceptual engine. It existed in a state of potential, undefined, fluid, until an observer focused on it. And when you focused, when you measured, when you said, this is here and it is like this, the system took that information, replicated it, expanded it, and presented it back to you. Bigger, more complex, infinitely detailed. I was the architect. I was the reason there were 441 trees instead of 412. I was the reason the trail was longer, the horizon further away, the world expanding. And if I kept doing it, eventually there would be no end to it. The forest would stretch forever. The land would fold and repeat until there was nothing else in existence but this exact same view, duplicated infinitely. A hall of mirrors made of granite and pine. I grabbed my binoculars again, my hands shaking violently. I focused on the western ridge, on the newest additions, the trees that hadn't existed a week ago. As I watched, I saw the process happen in real time. Between two massive ancient pines, in a gap of bare rock I knew was solid granite, the air shimmered. It was a subtle distortion, like heat haze rising off asphalt on a hot day, or the ripple you see when you drop a stone into still water. The light warped there for a fraction of a second. Then, a thin green line appeared, rising vertically from the stone. It shot upward with impossible speed, thickening as it went, branching out near the top, growing rough brown bark over its surface, sprouting needles, growing cones until it stood there, fully formed, 60 feet tall, heavy and solid, identical in every way to the trees standing on either side of it, and the rock beneath it. It wasn't rock anymore, it was soil. Dark, rich forest soil, covered in a carpet of fallen needles. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I forced my mind to remain blank, to stop categorizing, stop counting, stop defining. I tried to see it the way an animal might, or a child too young to understand numbers. Just green shapes, just pattern, just view. It worked. For a moment, the shimmering stopped. No new trees appeared. The existing ones seemed to blur slightly at the edges, less distinct, less solid, as if they were dissolving back into the potential from which they came. But it was hard. It was agonizingly hard. My brain rebelled against it. I was built to order the world, to see the tree and say, that is a tree, to see the gap and say, that is empty. Every instinct I had screamed at me to measure, to catalog, to know. I turned away from the window and walked to the center of the room. I looked at the Osborne fire finder, the brass ring with the compass rose, the telescopic sight used to pinpoint locations. It was a machine designed entirely for measurement, for assigning coordinates, for saying, this smoke is at 240 degrees, 3 miles. I realized the true horror of the job I had taken. I wasn't here to watch for fires. If a fire started, it would burn the duplicates and they would regenerate. I wasn't here to protect the forest. I was here to create it. Every lookout who had stood in this room for 70 years had done exactly what I did. Counted, measured, defined, expanded the territory of the anomaly, mile by mile, tree by tree. We weren't guardians. We were scribes. We were the lens through which this impossible place came into focus. I went out onto the deck. The wind was picking up, rushing through the canopy below, creating that familiar, deep, rushing sound that sounds like the ocean. But today I listened closely. It wasn't random noise. It was rhythmic. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Exactly the same duration, exactly the same pitch, repeating over and over again. And beneath the sound of the wind, carried on the breeze, I heard something else. A whisper. Millions of whispers, all speaking the same thing. See us, count us, define us, make us real. I looked out over the endless green expanse, stretching further than any map had ever recorded, growing larger every second I watched it. I looked at the ridgeline, now thick and solid, no gaps left, a continuous wall of pine, and I understood the title Elias had written on the last page of his notes, the title that had become the truth of my life. I count the pines at sunrise. There are always more than yesterday. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched out and out and out, seemingly forever, into a forest that had no end. I leaned over the railing, gripping the cold metal until my knuckles turned white. I knew then that I had a choice to make, a choice far greater than Hale or the Forest Service or anyone could have ever imagined. If I kept watching, kept counting, kept measuring, the world would keep growing, folding, repeating, swallowing more and more space until nothing else existed. If I stopped, if I looked away, if I forgot numbers, if I ceased to observe, would it all vanish? Would the trees dissolve back into mist? Would the land shrink back to its true size? Would I vanish, too, having no definition left to hold on to? I looked at my notebook, lying open on the desk inside, filled with pages and pages of numbers, my careful daily tallies. 412, 414, 417, 423, 441. I walked back inside, picked up the pen, and turned to a fresh page. I didn't write a number. I didn't write a coordinate. I wrote the only thing that mattered. Day 12. The view is infinite. I am the limit. I am the measure, and I am the reason it grows. Outside, as the sun finally slipped below the horizon and twilight descended, I saw a shimmer run across the entire landscape. From the ridge to the valley, from the near trees to the far horizon, everything rippled. Just for a second, waiting for me to wake up tomorrow morning. Waiting for me to look. Waiting for me to count again. And deep down, in the part of me that needed order, the part that needed to know exactly how many, exactly where, exactly what size, I already knew I would. Because once you start counting, you can never really stop. Night did not bring the relief I hoped for. In fact, the darkness made everything worse. Before this, night on Spruce Ridge had been beautiful. It was a velvet blackness pierced by more stars than I had ever seen in the city, sharp, cold, and distinct, burning with a clarity that felt ancient and unchanging. The moon cast soft silver light over the treetops, turning the forest into a sea of gray shapes and shadows, peaceful and still. I had spent hours sitting out here after sundown, drinking in the quiet, feeling small and insignificant in the best possible way. But tonight the dark felt heavy. It felt solid. I stood by the glass wall, looking down. Normally, once the sun went down, the individual trees lost their definition. They merged into a collective mass, a dark texture, a rolling silhouette against the sky. I couldn't count them at night, and so, according to what I had learned from Elias, they shouldn't have mattered. They should have returned to that fluid, undefined state of potential he described. Instead, I could still see them. They stood out in the gloom as distinct vertical lines, perfect parallel, equidistant columns rising out of the blackness. Even without light to illuminate them, my mind supplied the image. I knew they were there. I knew exactly where each one stood, exactly how tall it was, exactly how far apart they were spaced. And because I knew, the landscape held its shape. Rigid, ordered, geometric. It wasn't just that I could perceive them. It was that the forest itself seemed to be radiating an outline, a ghost image of its own existence that my eyes picked up, even in total darkness. I paced the small room, my boots thudding rhythmically on the wooden floorboards. Thud, thud, thud! And instantly, the forest below echoed it. I heard the same rhythm rising from the trees, distant, muffled, but perfectly synchronized. Thud, thud, thud. I stopped walking. The sound from below stopped too. "Stop it," I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking slightly. "It's just echo. It's just wind playing tricks." But I knew it wasn't. I understood the mechanism now, even if I didn't understand the why or the how. This place, this anomaly, this thing was a mirror, a complex, fractal mirror that didn't just reflect what stood in front of it, but expanded upon it. It took every input I gave it, every measurement, every observation, every definition, and processed it, replicated it, multiplied it, and fed it back to me as a larger, more complex reality. I was trapped inside a feedback loop of my own making. I went to the stove and lit the lamp, pulling the curtains closed, tight on all four sides, blocking out the view completely. If I couldn't see it, I told myself, it couldn't grow. If I denied it my attention, it would shrink back down to its proper size. I sat at the desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and tried to think logically, the way I used to in Chicago, solving zoning disputes or traffic problems. Let's model it, I thought. Let's treat it like a system. I drew a simple diagram. Observer. Observation. Definition. Replication. Expansion. New reality. Observer. It was a closed loop. Infinite recursion. The more detailed my observation, the more complex the reality. The more precise my measurement, the larger the space. Elias was right. I wasn't an observer. I was a variable. I was the independent variable in an equation where the landscape was the dependent result. But then, what was the original? What was the true size and shape of Spruce Ridge before anyone started counting? Was it just a single tree, a hill, a blank patch of ground? Did it even exist at all until someone looked at it? And if I was the one making it real, what happened to me? I looked down at my hands resting on the desk. They looked normal, solid, flesh and blood. But if the reality around me was contingent on my perception, was I also contingent? Was I only real because I perceived myself to be? Was I just as much a construct of the anomaly as the 441 pines on the western ridge? A soft scratching sound pulled me out of my thoughts. It came from the door, the heavy wooden door leading out onto the eastern deck. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Light, rhythmic, repetitive. My breath caught. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 11 p.m. No animals came this high up usually, not this time of night. No bird or squirrel made a sound like that. I stood up slowly, picking up the heavy iron fire poker I kept by the stove. I moved toward the door, stepping carefully so the floorboards wouldn't creak. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It stopped just for a second, then started again, louder, closer to the handle. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and small inside the wooden box of the tower. No answer, just the sound, and then a voice, soft, breathless, right against the wood. "Joseph, you forgot one." I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break them. "You forgot the one growing right by the steps, Joseph. It's been there all day. You missed it in your count. That makes 442. It was my own voice. Exactly my pitch, exactly my tone, exactly my cadence. It sounded like a recording played back through a slightly warped speaker. Perfect but for a tiny infinite repetition in the background. "Come look, Joseph. You have to be accurate. You have to measure. That's what you do." I remembered Elias's warning. It feeds on definition. It feeds on attention. If I opened that door, if I looked, if I acknowledged it, it would be true. The number would increase. The anomaly would expand again. Worse than that, it was mimicking me. It was becoming me. I backed away from the door, never taking my eyes off the heavy oak planks. "You aren't me," I said, forcing the words out through dry lips. "I know what I counted. I know what I saw. And there is no tree there." "Are you sure?" the voice whispered, sounding amused now. "Are you absolutely sure, Joseph? Because if there isn't a tree here, then what is making the sound? If there isn't a tree here, then I don't exist. And if I don't exist, then neither do you. Because you made me, Joseph. You made all of this. You defined it. You counted it. If you take it away, you take yourself away too." The logic was a trap, a perfect logical paradox designed to force me to validate it. To deny the existence of the anomaly was to deny my own role as its creator. To deny it was to accept that my entire reality here was a lie, which meant I was a lie. I sank back into the chair at the desk, trembling. It knew exactly how my mind worked. It knew I couldn't tolerate inaccuracy. It knew I couldn't handle uncertainty. It knew that the thought of being wrong, of having miscounted, of having made an error, was worse to me than the thought of the forest being infinite. It was using my own nature against me, just as it had used Elias, just as it had used every lookout before us. The scratching stopped. The voice faded into a soft, rushing sound, merging with the wind in the trees below. But the message remained, etched into my mind. Accuracy is everything. Count everything. Define everything. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by closed curtains, deliberately thinking of nothing. Or trying to. It was the hardest work I had ever done. To empty the mind, to stop categorizing, to look at a wall and not think, that is a wall made of wood, vertical, 8 feet high. To just see color and texture and light without assigning meaning or measurement. It was like holding my breath. I could do it for a minute, maybe 2, and then the instinct kicked in. The need to order the world rushed back and the forest grew. Every time I slipped, every time I mentally noted, the floor is cold or the lamp is bright, I felt a shift in the air, a distant rippling sensation from outside as the anomaly converted that tiny observation into new reality. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep around the edges of the curtains, I was exhausted, drained, my head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic pain behind my eyes. But I had to know. I had to see. I couldn't but not look. I stood up, walked to the west-facing window, gripped the edge of the heavy canvas curtain, and pulled it aside in one sharp motion. The view hit me like a physical blow. It was more trees, more hills, more ridges, more valleys. Yesterday, the ridgeline ended at the rocky outcrop at the southern end. Beyond that lay a steep drop into a valley, then rolling hills leading toward the open plains. Now the rocky outcrop was gone. It had been filled in, smoothed over, covered in soil and pine. The ridgeline simply continued. It curved gently southward, rising and falling in perfect identical waves, stretching out until it merged with the horizon, which was now twice as far away as it had been the day before. And the count. I didn't even need to start. I could see it instantly. The pattern was continuous, unbroken, infinite. 497, I whispered. The number just fell out of my mouth. Involuntary, automatic. 497 pines on the west ridge. And as soon as I said it, as soon as the concept formed in my mind, I saw the shimmer run along the line. 5 more trees popped into existence instantly, spaced perfectly between the gaps I hadn't even noticed were there. 502. I clamped my hand over my mouth, horrified. It was an addiction, a compulsion. Every number I spoke became a target, a limit that the system immediately exceeded. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the horizon, looking for something, anything that broke the pattern, something chaotic, something messy, something that looked like nature and not like a blueprint. And I found it. Far to the south, miles beyond where the ridge used to end, there was a disturbance, a break in the green. It looked like a scar on the landscape, a jagged, irregular patch where the trees were not straight, not tall, not identical. They were twisted, gnarled, bent over. Some were snapped off halfway up. Others were growing sideways, tangled together, chaotic and wild. And in the center of that chaos, rising above the broken canopy, stood another tower. It was identical to mine. 4 legs, glass room, metal roof, but it was damaged. One leg was splintered and broken. The roof was caved in. The glass was shattered, gaping open to the elements. And standing on the deck, looking back at me through binoculars exactly like mine, was a man. I zoomed in as far as the lenses would allow. My breath stopped. He looked exactly like me. Same build, same hair, same face. He was older, though. His hair was grayer. His face was lined, weathered, etched with deep lines of exhaustion and fear. But it was unmistakable. It was Joseph Wilhite. He lowered his binoculars and raised a hand in a slow, weary wave. Then he pointed down at the base of his tower. I followed the direction of his finger. At the foot of that broken tower, lying on the ground, half buried in pine needles and dirt, was a metal sign. Even at this distance, I could read it clearly, because I knew exactly what it said. Spruce Ridge. Elevation, 5,982 feet. St. 1937. I spun around, looking at the sign bolted to my tower. Same words, same numbers, same date. I looked back south. There were more towers now. I saw them rising above the trees, receding into the distance, one after another, smaller and smaller. Identical copies stretching away forever. Some were whole, some were broken, some were just skeletal remains, and on each deck stood a figure. Me. Older, younger, tired, terrified, resigned. It wasn't just the trees that were replicating. It wasn't just the hills I was replicating. Every time I had a thought, every time I made an observation, every time I defined my existence, I created another version of myself further out in the pattern, another observer to feed the machine, another counter to extend the line. I wasn't the first Joseph Wilhite. I wasn't the only one. I was just the current link in an infinite chain stretching backward and forward in time and space. Elias hadn't left. Elias was still here. Somewhere further out, older, more broken, still counting. Hale knew. The Ranger knew. That's why he warned me. That's why he said, "You are like him." He didn't mean personality. He meant function. He meant role. I dropped the binoculars. They clattered loudly to the floorboards. I understood the true nature of the conflict now. And it was far worse than just being trapped in a growing forest. This place wasn't just a mirror. It was a recording. It captured everything you were, everything you thought, everything you saw, and replayed it infinitely, projecting it outward into endless space. And the moral dilemma, the real choice I had to make, crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Do I continue to exist, to be real, to be something, by participating in the pattern, by counting, by measuring, by expanding this endless artificial reality? Or do I destroy the pattern, stop observing, stop defining, accept that I might cease to exist entirely, that I might dissolve back into the undefined nothingness from which I came, just to break the loop and let the world be real again? If I stayed, I would live forever in a sense. Infinite copies of me in an infinite forest, but it would be a hollow, repetitive, artificial immortality. No change, no growth, no reality, just more. If I left, truly left, by unseeing, by unlearning, by undefining, I might save the original land. I might save the world outside, but I would never exist again. There would be no memory of me, no trace. I would be a line erased from a drawing. I walked to the official logbook, the one Elias wrote in. I flipped to the very last page, the one after his final entry. There was a note I had missed before, scribbled in the gutter of the book, almost invisible. The only way out is to stop being the architect, to make something the system cannot copy, something imperfect, something wrong, something chaotic, chaos. The anomaly thrived on order, on measurement, on geometry, on repetition. It couldn't handle randomness, it couldn't handle error, it couldn't handle things that didn't make sense. That was the key, the flaw in the code. I looked around the room. Everything was neat, everything in its place, everything measured and organized. I walked to the shelf and grabbed a jar of nails. I walked to the window and hurled it as hard as I could against the wall. It shattered, metal clattered, nails scattered everywhere, rolling in random directions, bouncing off the floor and furniture. Instantly I felt it. A ripple of confusion passed through the air. Outside, the perfect lines of the trees wavered, the perfect spacing distorted. Some trees grew lopsided, others shrank slightly. The horizon wobbled. I did it again. I knocked the maps off the wall, crumpling them into balls. I overturned the chair. I spilled the water jug. I took the Osborne fire finder, the precision instrument, the heart of the measurement system, and I lifted it off its mount and threw it through the glass window facing west. Glass exploded outward, falling 40 feet to the ground below. Cold air rushed in, and the reaction was instantaneous. The forest screamed. It wasn't a sound, it was a sensation, a feeling of absolute wrongness, of error, of a program crashing. The perfect geometry dissolved, the parallel lines bent and twisted, the identical trees warped into strange, impossible shapes. The distance between objects fluctuated wildly. Things that were far away became close instantly. Things that were close seemed miles off. The horizon shattered like glass. I stood in the center of the room, arms raised, shouting at the top of my lungs, speaking words that had no meaning, numbers that didn't add up, descriptions that were impossible. Blue trees, square circles, up is down, left is right, 499.5, -12, infinity plus 1. I was breaking every rule. I was feeding it garbage data. I was giving it things it couldn't process, couldn't replicate, couldn't turn into reality, because they contradicted themselves. The effect was catastrophic. From outside, I heard the sound of millions of trees creaking and groaning, the sound of earth shifting, the sound of space tearing. The endless rows of identical pines began to collapse inward, folding over themselves, merging, vanishing, shrinking. The endless ridgelines shortened, contracting toward the center. The infinite receding towers blinked out of existence one by one, like lights being turned off, leaving only the scarred, chaotic patch I had seen earlier. The place where someone had tried this before. And the view. The view was changing rapidly. The distance was collapsing. The far hills were rushing toward me, shrinking in scale, returning to their proper place. The horizon was getting closer, smaller, defined again. I looked at the western ridge. The solid wall of trees was thinning. Gaps were appearing. Bare rock was showing through. The numbers were dropping fast. 450, 420, 415. I grabbed my notebook, the one with all my counts, my measurements, my definitions, my order. I tore out the pages, crumpled them into tight balls, and threw them out the broken window into the wind. 412, 410, 400 var. It wasn't just reducing the count, it was erasing the existence. Trees that had never been there dissolved into mist and shadow. The extra land vanished. The miles of extra forest folded up and disappeared. I looked down at the base of the tower. The ground was changing texture, going from that perfect, uniform, carpet-like soil to the rough, uneven, rocky earth I remembered from my hike. And then I saw it. The true edge of the forest. It was right there, just half a mile away. A clear line where the pines stopped abruptly and the open grasslands of the Great Plains began, stretching out flat and golden under the sun. Spruce Ridge wasn't 12 square miles. It wasn't infinite. It was exactly 3 square miles, just like the old map said. And standing at the very edge, watching the last of the extra forest dissolve into nothingness, was a single figure. It was Elias Vance. He looked young again. No gray hair, no exhaustion. He looked at me, smiled a sad, knowing smile, and raised his hand one last time. Before I could speak, before I could ask him anything, he turned and walked out of the trees, onto the open grass, and simply faded. He had broken the loop. He had escaped by destroying the pattern. I stood at the broken window, the wind whipping my hair, the cold air stinging my face. I looked at the western ridge. 412. Exactly 412 trees, no more, no less, just nature. Imperfect, messy, beautiful, real. I counted them one last time, just to be sure. But this time, I didn't write it down. I didn't fix it in my mind as a law. I just saw it. I accepted it. And then I let it go. I turned away from the view. I walked out onto the deck. The sun was high now, bright and warm, shining down on the real Black Hills. The wind moved through the trees in chaotic, unpredictable gusts, rustling the needles in random patterns, sounding like music rather than a recording. I looked up at the sign on the tower. Spruce Ridge elevation, 5,982 feet, Est, 1937. I understood now why the title of my time here was what it was. I count the pines at sunrise. There are always more than yesterday. It wasn't a description of the place. It was a warning about the counter. As long as you count, as long as you define, as long as you need order, there will always be more. I went back inside, packed my few belongings, and slung my bag over my shoulder. I didn't need the logbook anymore. I didn't need the maps. I didn't need the measurements. I descended the stairs, my boots hitting the real, solid ground. I walked to my truck, started the engine, and began the drive down the rough dirt road. I didn't look back. I didn't check the landmarks. I didn't measure the distance. I just drove. And as the forest fell away behind me and I hit the paved road leading into Custer, I smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. Because now when I look at the horizon, when I see trees, when I see hills, I don't count them. I don't need to know how many. I just need to know they are there and that they are real.